A racist white man gets into a confrontation with a black woman. He's shocked when she reveals she's an FBI agent. Jordan Blake parked her car under the shade of a large oak tree, feeling the weight of her week slide off her shoulders as she stepped out and took a deep breath. The city park was one of her favorite places to unwind, a spot where she could just be Jordan, not Agent Blake. Today, she had a good book, some snacks, and the whole afternoon to herself. The sun was warm, the breeze light, and the laughter of families and friends filled the air in a comforting, steady hum. It was a good day to relax. She found the perfect bench by the lake, set slightly apart from the main paths, with a clear view of the water and a few friendly ducks drifting by. She settled in, pulling out her book and letting herself sink into the world on the page. She'd only made it a few pages in when a voice cut through the air, harsh and loud. "Hey! You there!" Jordan looked up, startled, to see a man standing in front of her. He had an air of arrogance around him. His face was already twisted into a scowl, and he had his arms crossed over his chest, staring her down. "Can I help you?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. "Yeah, you can help me by moving," he snapped. "That's my bench." Jordan blinked, taken aback by his sudden hostility. "Excuse me? I didn't see any sign claiming this spot." The man rolled his eyes, his tone dripping with irritation. "I don't need a sign. I've been coming here for years. Everyone around here knows this is my spot." He gestured broadly, as if he owned not only the bench, but the entire lakeside view. Jordan let out a measured breath, trying to keep her voice calm. "Well, it's a public park, so there's plenty of space for everyone. I'm sure you can find another bench." The man's eyes narrowed, his face twisting further with contempt. "You don't get it, do you?" he sneered. "People like you don't just waltz in here and take over what isn't theirs." Jordan's spine straightened, a flash of anger flaring within her. She knew exactly what he meant, and he knew she did. "People like me?" she asked, her voice hardening. "Do you realize how ridiculous you sound?" He smirked, taking a step closer. "Not as ridiculous as someone like you thinking you belong here. Look around. You don't fit in." Jordan clenched her jaw, feeling the weight of his words press against her patience. She'd dealt with plenty of people who had this brand of arrogance, but she wasn't in the mood to let it slide today. "I don't need to fit in to sit on a bench," she said, her voice steady and unyielding. "If you have a problem with that, maybe you should find another spot." The man's face flushed, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He took another step closer, looming over her. "You think you can just talk to me like that?" he hissed. "I could make you move. In fact, maybe I should." Jordan didn't flinch, meeting his gaze head-on. "Touch me, and you'll regret it." Her tone was low but firm, carrying a weight that gave him pause. For a second, his bravado wavered as he registered her calm warning. But instead of backing off, he doubled down, leaning in closer, his voice a harsh whisper. "You people don't know when to keep your mouths shut," he sneered. "Maybe it's time you learn." Jordan's patience snapped. She stood up, her face inches from his, her voice rising with controlled anger. "Back off! Now! I'm not moving and you don't get to tell me what to do!" Her raised voice drew the attention of nearby park-goers, who turned to watch the confrontation. The man looked around, realizing the eyes on him, and a flicker of embarrassment crossed his face. But instead of apologizing, he clenched his jaw, muttering under his breath. "Fine. Enjoy your little attitude," he spat, his tone dripping with disdain. "You'll learn soon enough. You better be gone soon or you'll regret it." With one last glare, he turned on his heel, storming off toward the parking lot. Jordan watched him go, her heart pounding as she took a steadying breath. She looked around and saw a few people still watching, but they quickly turned away when she met their eyes. Ignoring them, she sat back down, her muscles still tight with frustration. She glanced back toward the parking lot, half expecting to see him stomping back her way. For now, he was gone. But his words lingered, scratching at the calm she'd come here to find. She forced herself to focus on the lake, taking a deep breath to calm her racing mind. Today was supposed to be about peace, she reminded herself. She wasn't going to let some stranger ruin that for her. But as she picked up her book again, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that this wasn't the last she'd see of him. Jordan tried to settle back into her book, her gaze tracing the words on the page without really reading them. The man's sneering face and grating words kept intruding on her thoughts, each sentence she read dissolving into fragments as her irritation lingered. She took a deep breath, willing herself to relax, to push his hostility out of her mind. But minutes later, that same shadow darkened her peripheral vision. She glanced up, and there he was again, standing over her with his arms crossed, his face twisted with anger. "Still here?" he sneered, leaning in closer. "I thought I made it clear that this is my spot." Jordan set her book down and slowly stood, matching his glare. "And I thought I made it clear that I'm not moving," she said, her voice steely. "This is a public park." The man's smirk deepened as he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a mocking tone. "You people always think you're entitled to whatever you want, don't you? Think you can just barge in here and take over, act like you belong?" Jordan clenched her fists, the simmering anger finally bubbling to the surface. "You don't get to talk to me like that," she snapped. "And if you have a problem with that, maybe you should go find a spot far, far away from me." But he didn't budge. Instead, he leaned even closer, his face inches from hers. "Oh, is that a threat? I'll have you know I don't take kindly to threats from people who don't belong here." She straightened, her voice low and calm. "The only person who doesn't belong here is the one who can't handle sharing a public space." The man's expression hardened, and suddenly his hand shot out, gripping her arm with surprising force. He yanked her up from the bench, his fingers digging into her skin, his face a mask of anger. Jordan twisted, trying to free herself, but his grip only tightened. "You think you're so tough?" he spat, his voice full of contempt. And then, before she could react, he raised his hand and slapped her hard across the face. The impact snapped her head to the side, pain flaring hot across her cheek. She steadied herself, forcing herself to stand tall, her cheek stinging, but her gaze unwavering as she looked him in the eye. "That was a mistake," she said, her voice deadly calm. "Oh, yeah?" he laughed, the sound hollow and mocking. "What are you going to do about it? Call the police? You think they're going to believe some angry black woman over me?" Jordan's patience evaporated, her voice hardening as she reached into her jacket pocket. "I don't need the police," she said quietly. She pulled out her FBI badge and held it up to his face, letting the metal glint in the sunlight. The man's smirk faded, his eyes widening as he took in the badge, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process what he was seeing. Jordan took a step forward, her voice cold and steady. "I'm FBI, and I'm placing you under arrest for assault." He stumbled back, his hands going up defensively, his face drained of color. Wait a second," he stammered, his confidence shattering. You're really FBI?" "That's right," she replied, her voice steady. "Put your hands behind your back." For a moment, he seemed frozen, his mind racing as he stared at the badge, disbelief flickering across his face. Then, as if jolted back to reality, he took another step back, his eyes darting around in panic. You can't do this," he sputtered, his voice shaking. This is ridiculous. You're bluffing." Jordan remained calm, taking another step forward, keeping her gaze fixed on him. "This is your last warning. Turn around, hands behind your back. Now!" But instead of complying, he glanced wildly around the empty area, his face twisting with a sudden desperation. Then, without another word, he turned and bolted, breaking into a full run toward the parking lot. Jordan's instincts kicked in, and she took off after him, sprinting across the grass, her focus narrowed on the back of his retreating figure. Her mind was already calculating his likely moves, the layout of the parking lot, the speed it would take to catch up with him. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes widening when he saw her gaining on him. He pushed himself harder, his pace frantic as he reached the edge of the parking lot, fumbling for his car keys. Jordan closed in, her breath steady as she calculated her next move. But just as she was within reach, he managed to yank his car door open and dive inside. She reached for the handle, but he slammed the door shut and locked it, fumbling to start the engine. For a split second, their eyes met through the glass, his filled with panic, hers steady and unyielding. "Step out of the car," she ordered, her voice loud and firm. But he ignored her, his hands shaking as he finally managed to start the car. The engine roared to life, and with a screech of tires, he backed out of the space, narrowly missing another parked car as he sped out of the lot, leaving Jordan standing in a cloud of dust and exhaust. She watched him go, her hands on her hips as she took a steadying breath. She had his license plate number, his face burned into her memory. He'd run, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jordan didn't waste a second. As the dust settled from the man's hasty escape, she pulled out her phone and dialed into the FBI dispatch. quickly relaying his license plate number and a description of his vehicle. After updating them on the assault and her pursuit, she requested backup in the general direction she knew he'd taken. Suspect fleeing in a blue sedan, license plate Bravo Tango 047. Will intercept, she said into the phone, slipping her badge back into her jacket. Without hesitation, she jumped into her own car, the engine roaring to life as she pulled out of the lot. Her focus sharpened as she drove. The road was mostly clear at this hour, and she knew the city streets well enough to guess where he might try to go to avoid traffic and elude her. As she scanned the area, adrenaline pulsed through her veins, every nerve on high alert. The slap across her cheek still stung, and the memory of his smirk only fueled her determination to catch him. She drove with precision, her eyes darting from road to side streets, anticipating his next moves. After a few minutes, she spotted him up ahead, weaving in and out of traffic, his car jerking side to side as he struggled to stay ahead of her. His movements were erratic, panicked, as he ran a red light, narrowly missing an oncoming car that screeched to a halt in his wake. Jordan narrowed her eyes, gripping the wheel as she pressed forward. She accelerated, keeping a safe distance as she maneuvered through the traffic he left in disarray. It was clear he was making his way toward the outskirts of town, likely hoping to escape into the quieter roads where he might lose her trail. But she was ready. She saw her opening when he turned onto a side street, a narrow road that connected to an isolated industrial area. Jordan floored the gas, anticipating his next turn, and taking a quick shortcut that cut off a few seconds. As he came around a bend, she swung out ahead of him, cutting him off and bringing her car to a quick, controlled stop. She stepped out of her vehicle, her voice commanding, "Step out of the car! Now!" He froze, his eyes wide as he stared at her through the windshield, realization dawning on him that he had no more room to run. She could see his hands clenching the wheel, his mind racing as he glanced around for any possible escape. But they were alone on this quiet stretch of road. The only sound his car's engine idling, trapped between her vehicle and a dead end. With a sigh of resignation and clear frustration, he slowly opened the door, stepping out with his hands raised halfway. "This is ridiculous!" he shouted, the anger from earlier back in his voice, but now mixed with a hint of desperation. "You don't have any right to do this. You're just overreacting." Jordan kept eyes trained on him, her stance firm, her voice unwavering. "Assaulting a federal officer and evading arrest isn't a minor issue, and you're out of options. Get down on the ground." He hesitated, his eyes darting from side to side, as if still hoping for a way out. "This is insane. You can't do this to me. I didn't even do anything wrong. I'll have your job for this." But Jordan's calm didn't falter. "You put your hands on me, you resisted arrest, and you fled from law enforcement. I have every right to arrest you, and I'd suggest you stop making this harder on yourself." Seeing that she wasn't bluffing, he slowly got down on his knees, his face contorting with a mix of anger and humiliation. "You don't know who I am," he muttered, his voice shaking as he glared up at her. "I'm well connected. You're gonna regret this. Hands behind your back," she commanded, ignoring his threats. Now, reluctantly, he brought his hands around, and she moved in, snapping the cuffs onto his wrists. As she secured them, he let out a string of muttered curses, his words dripping with anger. "You're making the biggest mistake of your career," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. Jordan pulled him up by his arm, keeping a firm grip as she guided him toward her car. "You're welcome to bring that up in court," she replied calmly, pushing him into the back seat. He struggled against the cuffs, his eyes flashing with hatred as he glared at her through the rearview mirror. "This isn't over," he said, his voice shaky but defiant. "You're going to regret crossing me." But Jordan simply closed the door, locking it before getting into the driver's seat. She glanced at him in the mirror, her expression steady, unfazed by his threats. "The only thing I regret," she said, starting the engine, "is that I didn't arrest you sooner." As she pulled back onto the road, she radioed in, informing dispatch that the suspect was in custody. He slumped in the back seat, silent now, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. But he was caught. His bravado faded, and he was left to contemplate the reality of his actions as they drove toward the nearest precinct. The drive was silent, save for the hum of the engine and his occasional muttered complaints. But Jordan didn't mind the quiet. It was a satisfying kind of silence, one that reminded her of why she did what she did. As they neared the station, she allowed herself a small, private smile. He'd run, he'd threatened, he'd lashed out. But in the end, justice had caught up with him. Jordan gripped Gregory Hale's arm firmly as she led him into the precinct. His once imposing presence reduced to a tense, bitter figure as they moved through the bustling corridors. He looked around, his face tight and pale, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with a mix of disbelief and disdain. For perhaps the first time in his life, Hale wasn't the one in control, and the realization seemed to unsettle him. The officers at the front desk looked up as Jordan brought Hale forward, a few of them exchanging curious glances. One officer, a tall man with a thick mustache, gave a low whistle as he took in Hale's defiant glare. "Well, well, who do we have here?" the officer said, his voice amused as he took in Hale's attempt to look unaffected. "This is Gregory Hale," Jordan replied, her tone all business. "He's here on charges of assaulting a federal officer, resisting arrest, and evading law enforcement." The officer raised an eyebrow, impressed, before shifting his gaze to Hale. "Fancy look. High-dollar watch. Guess that didn't do you much good, did it?" He chuckled, shaking his head as he entered Hale's information into the system. "You might be the most high-maintenance arrest I've seen this month." Hale shot the officer a venomous glare, clearly unused to being the target of such comments. "This is absurd," he muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Do you even know who I am?" The officer snorted, smirking as he looked Hale up and down. "Oh, we know exactly who you are," he replied, his tone mocking. "And we also know what you did, which means right now you're just another perp waiting for a cell." Jordan's face remained impassive, but she felt a flicker of satisfaction at the officer's words. Hale had spent the entire day believing his influence and connections would shield him, and now he was finally starting to understand just how wrong he'd been. As the booking process continued, Hale grew increasingly uncomfortable, his bravado slowly crumbling. He tried to argue, to justify his actions, but his words held no weight here. With each step, fingerprints, photographs, and paperwork, the reality of his situation became clearer. Another officer, a no-nonsense woman in her early 50s with a sharp gaze, took Hale's fingerprints, guiding him to press each finger down onto the ink pad before rolling it onto the paper. She looked at him with thinly veiled annoyance. "You don't have any idea how dumb this was, do you?" she said, her voice cutting through his quiet muttering. "You thought you could just slap a federal officer and get away with it?" Hale glared at her, his face flushed with anger. "I didn't know she was FBI," he snapped, as if that somehow excused his behavior. "This whole thing is being blown way out of proportion. I didn't do anything wrong." The officer let out a disbelieving laugh. "Didn't do anything wrong? You slapped a woman in public and then tried to run from the law. I'd say that's more than enough wrong." Hale's jaw tightened, and he turned to Jordan, his eyes blazing with frustration. "You're really going to throw away your career over this?" he sneered. "Do you have any idea what kind of connections I have? You could have walked away from this, but instead, you had to make it personal." Jordan met his gaze with a steady look, unshaken. "This isn't personal, Mr. Hale," she replied calmly. "It's justice. You attacked me, resisted arrest, and thought you were above the law. My job is to ensure that people who believe they can escape accountability face the consequences of their actions." One of the younger officers overheard her response and gave a small, approving nod. Hale, however, bristled at her words, his face reddening as he clenched his fists. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he muttered, his voice low but threatening. "This isn't over. People like me don't go down without a fight." "People like you?" The officer with the mustache raised an eyebrow. "Last I checked, people like you don't get a free pass for breaking the law. Maybe that's news to you, but around here, everyone faces the music." Hale opened his mouth to retort, but before he could respond, the officer guided him toward the cell area, a satisfied look on his face. "Now, let's get you settled in." Hale stiffened, clearly insulted at the idea of being treated like the rest. He looked around the precinct, trying to maintain a semblance of his former arrogance, but there was an edge of fear in his eyes now. As they reached the holding cell, Hale turned back to Jordan, his face tight with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life, you know that?" he hissed, his voice low. "I have connections, resources. You don't stand a chance." Jordan crossed her arms, her expression unmoved. "Mr. Hale, I don't care about your connections. You're here because of your actions, not your title or your wealth, and I assure you, threats won't get you out of this." The officer with the mustache shook his head in disbelief, chuckling as he unlocked the cell door. I've seen some arrogant types in here. But you, my friend, take the cake. You really thought no one was going to hold you accountable? Hale glared at him, stepping into the cell with a scowl. This is all going to backfire on you, he muttered, his voice shaky but defiant. People like me don't end up in places like this. The officer rolled his eyes, giving Hale a slight nudge as he closed the cell door behind him. Get comfortable, Mr. Hale, he said dryly. You might be in here a while. And for the record, people like you end up in here every day when they think they're untouchable. Jordan watched as Hale sat down on the cold metal bench, his eyes darting around the cell with a look of disgust. His bravado had all but faded now, replaced by the undeniable reality of his situation. He was trapped, and his usual tactics, threats, intimidation, and entitlement, were useless here. As she turned to leave, he called after her, desperation seeping into his voice. This isn't over, he muttered, barely loud enough to hear. You'll regret this. Jordan paused, glancing back over her shoulder, her expression calm and unshaken. The only thing I regret is that you thought you were above the law. You're about to learn just how wrong you were. With that, she walked away, leaving Hale alone in the quiet of the cell, his arrogance stripped away and his fate sealed. She exchanged a few words with the booking officers, signing the necessary paperwork to complete his intake, and then made her way back outside, letting out a long, steadying breath as she felt the tension of the day start to lift. The fresh air filled her lungs, and she closed her eyes for a moment, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. Hale had assumed his wealth and connections would shield him, that he could act without consequence. But today, justice had spoken louder than his threats or money, reminding him that no one, not even Gregory Hale, was above the law. As she walked to her car, she knew this wasn't the last she'd hear of him. Men like Hale didn't accept consequences easily, but if he underestimated her again, she'd be there, ready to remind him just as she had today. Justice was blind to privilege, and in the end, no one was untouchable. The days following Gregory Hale's arrest were tense. Jordan expected pushback, and it wasn't long before she received her first call from his legal team. They were polished, precise, and aggressive, wasting no time in trying to make her second-guess her actions. Her phone rang as she sat at her desk, and she recognized the firm's name on the caller ID, a well-known law office that catered to elite clients. She picked up, and a measured voice introduced himself as John Merrick, Hale's attorney. Agent Blake, Merrick began, his tone cordial, yet edged with steel. I hope you understand that our client is facing undue charges. Mr. Hale has no criminal record, and has been a respected member of the community. Given the circumstances, we feel it would be in everyone's best interest to dismiss this case. Jordan raised an eyebrow, recognizing the carefully masked threat beneath his words. Your client assaulted a federal agent, resisted arrest, and evaded law enforcement, Mr. Merrick, she replied calmly. This case isn't going away. There was a slight pause on the other end, and she could practically hear the lawyer adjusting his approach. Agent Blake, he continued, voice smooth but cold. Perhaps you're unaware of the power Mr. Hale holds. His connections run deep, and he has a reputation to maintain. A public trial could be detrimental not only for him, but for you as well. Jordan's jaw tightened, but she kept her tone steady. Are you implying that pursuing justice for an assault on a federal agent could harm my career, Mr. Merrick? I'm simply advising caution, Merrick replied, his tone unchanging. Mr. Hale is prepared to defend his reputation and, if necessary, discredit anyone involved in this case. We would hate to see such a promising agent like yourself caught in unnecessary legal battles or media attention. With the right agreement, this can all go away. Jordan's patience was wearing thin. I don't negotiate with people who think they're above the law, Mr. Merrick. Tell Mr. Hale that we'll see him in court. Without another word, she hung up, feeling a renewed determination settle over her. She knew men like Hale thrived on intimidation and manipulation. But this time, his tactics weren't going to work. As the trial date approached, Hale's legal team ramped up their efforts, filing motions to have the charges reduced or dismissed, and attempting to smear her reputation with subtle, strategic leaks to the media. Headlines popped up in local papers questioning her handling of the arrest, her judgment in the field, and other details intended to paint her as overzealous. But each tactic only strengthened her resolve. She had truth on her side, and Hale's underhanded maneuvers only solidified her belief that he needed to be held accountable. When the trial finally arrived, the courtroom was packed with spectators. Friends and colleagues of Hale's had shown up in support, and a few reporters lingered near the back, eager to catch the latest update in the high-profile case. Jordan took her seat in the front row, her face composed and calm, prepared for the days ahead. Across the room, Hale sat at the defense table, dressed in a tailored suit, his face drawn and tense. The smug confidence he'd once worn was gone, replaced by a look of barely concealed resentment. His legal team sat beside him, whispering last-minute advice, casting furtive glances around the room. The judge entered, and silence fell as the trial began. Opening statements started with the prosecutor, who outlined the case against Hale with a calm, clear voice. He described Hale's confrontational behavior at the park, the assault on a federal officer, the attempt to evade arrest, and his blatant disregard for accountability. The prosecutor emphasized Hale's sense of entitlement, his belief that his status could shield him from consequences. Then it was the defense's turn. Merrick rose, his expression cool and controlled as he addressed the jury, speaking in a smooth, almost patronizing tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client is a successful businessman, a respected member of the community. Yes, there was a confrontation, but this is a case of misunderstandings and emotions running high. Mr. Hale's intentions were never malicious. He was merely frustrated. We all have moments where emotions get the better of us." Merrick then went on to imply that Jordan's actions were unnecessarily aggressive. Agent Blake's actions reflect an excessive response to a minor disagreement. She could have diffused the situation, but instead chose to escalate it, leading to this unfortunate series of events. Jordan watched the jury as he spoke, noting a few furrowed brows and skeptical glances. The judge's expression remained neutral, but his eyes were sharp, absorbing every detail. When the prosecution called her to the stand, she rose, walking to the witness box with steady steps. She swore to tell the truth, then took her seat, her gaze meeting each juror as she prepared to recount the events. The prosecutor guided her through her testimony, and she recounted the day of the incident with calm precision. She described how the confrontation had started innocently enough, a simple argument over a public bench that rapidly escalated when Hale began making entitled, degrading remarks. She detailed his mocking tone, his words of intimidation, and the moment he'd slapped her, assuming his power and connections would protect him. "He slapped me, then mocked me," she said steadily. "He told me that no one would believe me because of who I am. He made it clear that he thought he was untouchable, that his connections would shield him from any consequences." Her words hung in the air, resonating through the silent courtroom. She glanced at the jury, watching their reactions. A few of them shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances that showed their unease. The defense's turn came next, and Merrick's voice was a smooth blade as he began his cross-examination. "Agent Blake, as a federal agent, would you say you're trained to handle high-stress situations without escalating them?" "Yes," she replied calmly, meeting his gaze. "Then wouldn't you agree that walking away might have been the best option in this case?" he pressed, his tone almost condescending. Jordan held her ground. "The situation didn't start as an escalation. I was simply enjoying the park. Mr. Hale was the one who approached me aggressively, and he continued to escalate even after I asked him to leave. Walking away wouldn't have changed his behavior. It would have enabled it." Merrick's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his polished demeanor. "Would you say you could have called for local law enforcement backup rather than taking matters into your own hands?" "I attempted to reason with him," she answered firmly. "When he assaulted me and then fled, it became my duty as a federal agent to pursue and arrest him." Merrick moved on, addressing the jury with an appeal to sympathy. "Ladies and gentlemen, everyone makes mistakes. My client was frustrated, but this entire situation has been exaggerated beyond reason, and what should be a minor charge has turned into an overblown prosecution." But as he sat down, Jordan noted the shifting expressions of the jury. They had seen Hale's entitled demeanor and heard Jordan's unwavering testimony. The defense's attempt to paint him as a victim seemed to be falling flat. Hale took the stand next, and Jordan noted the nervous flicker in his eyes, the strain in his voice as he recounted the incident. He claimed he'd simply lost his temper, that he hadn't meant for things to go this far, and that the situation had been blown out of proportion. The prosecutor's cross-examination was swift and unforgiving. "Mr. Hale, you told Agent Blake that no one would believe her because of who she was. Are you denying that statement?" Hale squirmed, his jaw tight as he stammered, I didn't mean it like that." The prosecutor paused, his gaze cool. "So, in your own words, how did you mean it?" Hale's mouth opened, then closed, his face flushed as he struggled for an answer. The silence hung heavy, his previous bravado deflated under the weight of the prosecutor's question. Closing arguments came quickly. The prosecutor underscored the importance of accountability, emphasizing Hale's sense of entitlement and his attempts to evade responsibility. Merrick made one last appeal to sympathy, portraying Hale as a good man who made a mistake, but the jury's expression suggested they were unconvinced. After only a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. Gregory Hale sat motionless, his face pale as the judge read the verdict, his disbelief evident. When the court reconvened for sentencing, the judge addressed Hale directly. "Mr. Hale, you assaulted a federal agent, evaded arrest, and displayed a blatant disregard for the law. Your actions reflect an arrogance that has no place in our society. You will face justice, just as anyone else would." The judge sentenced Hale to 3 years in state prison, with an additional 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and mandatory anger management counseling. The sentence was met with murmurs from the gallery, while Hale sat, stunned, the reality of his fate settling heavily upon him. As the court adjourned, Jordan watched Hale being led from the room in handcuffs, his face twisted in frustration and shame. Justice had been served, and for the first time, he would face real consequences. Outside, she took a deep breath, the weight of the ordeal finally lifting. Gregory Hale's influence had met its limit, and she could move forward, knowing she'd done her job. A week after the trial, Jordan found herself at a quiet cafe, sipping her coffee and processing the whirlwind of events that had led to Gregory Hale's sentencing. The court case had been grueling, and the backlash from Hale's supporters and the media had been exhausting. But Hale's conviction and prison sentence were solid victories. Not just for her, but for everyone who had ever felt the sting of injustice. Her phone buzzed with notifications, each one a new article covering the case. Headlines highlighted Hale's downfall, his former status as a respected businessman turned convict. Some reports touched on the assault and the arrogance behind it, while others stirred up debates about race and power. Comment sections were rife with arguments, some saying that his mistake didn't warrant such a severe punishment, while others called his sentence long overdue. Jordan saw her own name mentioned frequently. Some called her a hero for standing up to Hale, while others accused her of making an example out of him. She even noticed a few subtle racial undertones, comments questioning her judgment, calling her too aggressive, or implying that her actions stemmed from a chip on her shoulder rather than a commitment to justice. The racism didn't surprise her. It was something she'd felt simmering from the moment Hale had approached her in the park. She knew that his entitlement wasn't just about wealth or status. It was also about the unspoken power he assumed he had over her because of her race. He had mocked her, calling her "you people," and insisted that no one would believe her because of who she was. That moment had confirmed to her that his aggression wasn't just personal. It was deeply ingrained, a lifetime of privilege wrapped in prejudice. Later, she met her friend and fellow agent Maya Torres for lunch. Maya had always been one to call things out for what they were, and Jordan appreciated her bluntness, especially now. "Did you see some of those comments online?" Maya asked, rolling her eyes. "People are still trying to defend him, saying he just lost his temper and shouldn't have been punished." Jordan nodded, stirring her coffee. "I saw. A lot of them think I overreacted, that it was just one slap," she replied, a hint of bitterness creeping into her voice. "But it was more than that. And you know it. It was about control, entitlement, and race. He saw me and thought he could talk to me however he wanted, put his hands on me, and walk away unscathed." Maya shook her head, her expression tight. "Exactly. They don't get it. They've never had to. People like Hale think they can act any way they want, and for so long they've been right. But when he realized you weren't just going to sit there and take it, he panicked." Jordan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of those words. Hale had assumed she'd back down, that she'd be intimidated. And when she hadn't, his racism and entitlement had surfaced even more boldly, culminating in that slap. He hadn't just seen her as an officer or even another person. He'd seen her as someone beneath him, someone who, in his mind, wasn't supposed to challenge him. "You know," Jordan said, glancing out the window. "He had every advantage, his money, his connections. He really believed he could walk away, and for a moment I wondered if he might. But he didn't," Maya replied firmly, leaning in. "You held him accountable. Men like him, they're not used to hearing no, especially not from someone they think they can control. That's why this case is so important. It's not just about justice. It's about showing that no one's above accountability." Jordan nodded slowly, letting Maya's words sink in. She'd felt that same pressure throughout the trial. A subtle but constant reminder that she wasn't only standing up to one man's arrogance, she was confronting a system that had allowed him to believe he was untouchable. And for Hale, a black woman standing up to him and holding him accountable was perhaps the ultimate humiliation, a reality that clashed with his deeply ingrained beliefs. A few days later, Jordan returned to her office to find her inbox flooded with letters and emails. Some were supportive, congratulating her for her bravery, recognizing the importance of her role in Hale's conviction. But others were harsher, even cruel, laced with subtle or outright racism. A few letters accused her of ruining a good man's life, of overstepping her place, as if she had somehow violated an unspoken rule by demanding that Hale be held accountable. She felt a twinge of sadness, but she knew this was part of a broader, more painful reality. She was reminded that, for some, her actions would always be judged differently, scrutinized more harshly, simply because of who she was. But she also felt a sense of pride. She'd faced down that prejudice head-on, refusing to let it intimidate or silence her. Her supervisor, Agent Ramirez, stopped by her office later that day, leaning against the doorway with a nod of approval. "I saw the articles," he said. "You did good, Jordan. People will talk. They'll criticize, but what you did was right. It takes strength to stand up to someone who thinks they're invincible." Jordan smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thank you. It's been a lot to handle, and I knew there'd be backlash. But I knew I couldn't just let him get away with it. Not with everything he said and did." Ramirez nodded, a proud glint in his eyes. "And that's what makes you a good agent. You stood your ground even when it got ugly. People need to see that. It might not change everyone, but it matters." As the days went by, the media buzz around the trial began to fade. But Jordan still felt the quiet impact of the case. She'd encountered moments of racism before, both overt and subtle. But this case had brought it to the surface in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about Hale's actions. It was about what he represented. A part of society that too often looked the other way. In the following weeks, people in the precinct and community reached out to her. Some colleagues stopped her in the hall to congratulate her quietly. A few strangers recognized her at the grocery store, nodding in solidarity. They knew what her fight meant, that it was more than just about the law. One afternoon, as she walked down the street, an older black woman approached her with a warm smile. "I saw what you did in that courtroom," she said, her voice filled with quiet pride. "You didn't just stand up for yourself, you stood up for all of us." Jordan felt a lump rise in her throat as she thanked the woman, realizing in that moment just how deeply the case had resonated. Gregory Hale's sentence was more than just time served. It was a message, a reminder that no one, no matter their wealth or privilege, was untouchable. As she walked away, Jordan felt a sense of closure and strength. She knew the fight against entitlement and prejudice was far from over. But this was a victory, and in the quiet spaces of her mind, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd accomplished, knowing she'd not only done her job, but had upheld a justice far more profound.